Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to DataLit, a podcast for educators by educators. So today's episode, we want to sort of pre-advertise, a teaser for a two-part mini-series that we're going to be launching soon that is centered around this blog that came from the Center of Assessment that is looking at bridging the worlds of accountability and school improvement. And so before we begin in that two-part series, we kind of wanted to take you back to an episode from our first season. Spencer, do you remember that episode?
Yeah, not only is it just any episode, it was our first episode.
Okay.
Yeah, September 3rd, 2020.
All right.
Yeah.
So that one was called The Purpose of Assessments. And in that one, we started off by kind of having these metaphors for assessment. Spencer, you remember what those were?
So I listened to this again for the first time, however, who knows how long. I remembered the stool, and we've referenced that a few times throughout. I vaguely remembered the Latin, the astere, sit beside, which they'll hear in a few minutes. I did not remember the hamburger metaphor. That one, I did not
remember that, nor the potty training one. I was just yep. So, we use several metaphors to kind of talk about the purpose of assessments, especially from different roles, right? Whether you be a student, a teacher, or a parent. But the point of using those metaphors was to sort of highlight that assessments are not just for collecting data, but for understanding learning so that we can make these adjustments and support growth. And so what we want to do is sort of talk to you about there needs to be a sort of balance when we're thinking about assessments, right? They're supposed to be good for evidence, but they're also supposed to be used for taking action. And so we want to see that accountability, right? The hope of this article that we're going to be talking about in the next two episodes is that we would love to see accountability sort of be used in a similar fashion, right?
Yeah.
Accountability doesn't have to be bad accountability, but just like any good assessment, if we use accountability right, it can be used to provide feedback on teaching and learning.
Well put.
All right, so we're going to play the clip from our first assessments, and then we're going to come back and wrap up.
Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Serena Halstead.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to our DataLit podcast. As we may have mentioned, we are hoping to use this podcast to engage our listeners with many assessment and data topics. Now, while Spencer, Serena, and I have had many conversations of our own on assessment and data, we always seem to come back to one central idea. What is the purpose? So we thought, what better way to kick off our podcast than to have an episode that looks at the purpose of assessments?
And as we were thinking about that, I don't know if this reflects oddly upon me, but what popped in my head was actually potty training. I have a toddler at home. She's about 3.5. And over the last year, it's a little bit longer than maybe ought to have been, we went through the whole potty training rigmarole. It was a process. We would talk to Eva about it and explain what we're going to do and show her the little like Minnie Mouse theme kind of potty and, review with her, okay, what are the steps that we want to do? And then eventually it came time for having her try, and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. We kind of gave her feedback and had conversations. And little by little, she took that feedback and she took those experiences and she became potty trained. And really, though there was no, multiple choice assessments or those kind of things there, it was really just a series of assessments throughout the process. Some formative, some kind of quick checks. Some were multiple choice where I gave her two options and she tells me what she should be doing. Then some kind of performance assessments where she sat on the potty and either did it or she didn't. And this to me is kind of a really natural, organic sense of what assessment is. And I think we lose that sometimes when we overcomplicate things with school. But for me, the potty training of Eva is kind of an idea of what assessments can be.
So I think that draws into mind, assessment tends to have this sort of negative connotation. But if you think of an assessment as an evidence eliciting technique, then we're constantly in assessment mode, right? Because you're constantly, if you do something, then you're looking for evidence of it being done. So I think that potty training example is really the crux of it, because again, if you think of assessment as I'm just trying to elicit evidence of doing something.
So thinking about assessment here, I'm thinking more so assessment is about giving feedback, because thinking about the potty training, you want her to do, you have taught her, you have said some things to her, but each time she goes and she tries using it, you have to provide some feedback for her to do something next. And that feedback is that ongoing learning. How am I doing in my learning? Am I improving? Am I doing what you want me to do? So when I think of assessment, I think of it as, the purpose of it is to give feedback on learning.
That's a good point. And kind of going back to what we chatted about with the trailer, that if you extract out of assessment that personal relationship and that communication from the instructor to the students, and you have just the assessment, it doesn't work. If Eva just kind of sat on the potty and whatever happens, and then there was no conversation afterwards, it kind of falls flat. And the same is true with assessment, that the form of the assessment, as we'll talk about over the next few episodes, is key and is important for educators to understand, so that when they are implementing certain assessment methods, they know how to maximize them. But ultimately, I think it's helpful to remember that there's a quote from an article I like, Assessment as an Act of Love, that talks about, it says, it turns out that life is really a series of data-informed assessments and actions. Where she was talking about thinking back when she was a kid, and she would read her mom and say, like, what kind of mood is my mom in? Is now the time to ask for like another cookie? Can I push back bedtime? These kind of things there. And she would assess the situation, make decisions there.
So this podcast is going to really revolve around assessments and the data that it generates. In fact, our first two series are on assessment methods and assessment types. And we thought it might be worthwhile to, before jumping into the specifics, take a step back and look at what does assessment truly mean. And we're going to do that by presenting 3 different models for how you might think of an assessment and breaking down each one.
For me, I like to start off with the purpose or the goal. So for me, the goal of assessment has to be like a support. So it supports the improvement of teaching and learning. So I like to think of assessment as like a hamburger. And so the assessment of itself is your patty in the middle, with the teaching and learning being your buns. And so nobody likes to eat bun on bun. So you just can't have teaching and learning by itself. You kind of need both buns and the assessment in the middle to kind of have that perfect, complete picture.
I like that. As an educator and as a carb lover.
And, going back to your idea of a bun, Mellisa, I am thinking about the burger. I'm thinking more so the bun being the curriculum, the bun also being the instruction, but then the assessment comes right there in the middle. So definitely this idea, you mentioned it being an hamburger, then there's the idea of assessment being that part of a balance of a 3-legged stool. So let's see where we go with that in terms of how we look at assessments.
It's also nice to think of assessment in the middle, because I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking as the assessment as the period at the end of the sentence, that you do everything and then you have an assessment and then kids just disappear for the summer or something like that. And yes, as we'll talk about with our assessment types series, outcome assessments can be really helpful, but you always need to then act upon what you learn from the assessment and use it to improve instruction, figure out where kids need to go next and how you can modify your teaching for them. So that hamburger model, I think that's good. I like that model. Another model you can look at kind of is going back and looking at the roots of the word. So assessment itself it goes back to a Latin word, and there's about like a 2% chance that I pronounce this correctly. So sorry in advance, any Latin fans. But assessment goes back to the Latin root assedere, which actually means to sit with or to sit beside. And I think this is really kind of a beautiful model and a beautiful image for what assessment can be. So if you think of like a teacher sitting next to a kid as they're working through a standard or an idea, and the teacher's just kind of giving a little feedback here and there and helping the kid as they're going through their learning goals. But the fact is there's one teacher and there's a whole bunch of kids. So the idea is an assessment can be that resource on the side that's helping kids along. What are your thoughts on this model?
So I like that idea, Spencer. Thinking about assessment, that person sitting beside me as I go, right? So I'm thinking more so then the assessment drives the instruction, right? So thinking about assessment being that the teacher is trying to collect evidence of the student's learning. And based on what she is picking up on what the student is doing, right, that assessment determines our next step. So the assessment really is ongoing. It's side by side with the instruction. It is the driver of the instruction.
For me, I like that model because, again, there's some humility in that image of sitting next to or being beside someone, right? Where when we were talking about some of our experiences, assessment can have this sort of thing where it's either top down or, the person, there's a power struggle going on. But if you start to see assessment as this sitting next to, there's a sort of coming together, like a shoulder to shoulder sort of imagery that I think comes to mind, that I really like that idea of it's not I am over you or I am bigger than you, I know more than you, but I'm learning from you as you learn from me.
Yeah, to hop on Serena's metaphor, I think it breaks down the hierarchy in education a bit, and it puts the student in the driver's seat, and then the assessment is there to help them along that route. Therefore, it kind of transforms thinking of assessment as something that we do to kids, as something that we do with and for kids. And that to me, I think is pretty powerful as you switch to that, assessment of learning to assessment for learning.
Or as learning, as the new word is, right?
Right.
So that's another way you can think of assessment as sitting with or beside a student. And Serena, you had a model as well. Which one was yours?
So my model was the three-legged stool, right? And I kind of touched on that before, where with this stool, for the stool to be balanced any at all, we need to have the curriculum as one of the pegs. Then we have the instruction and then assessment, right? And so trying to move one of the legs from the stool, then definitely it's going to tumble, right? So for this model, we're saying that it has to be balanced, or instruction cannot supersede the assessment. So think about giving, you're teaching all of this week, and then you give an assessment that does not match with what you were teaching. All right. Or better yet, you have the curriculum standards, you have the standards that the students need to, know and be able to do. Then you look at the standard and you interpreted the standards wrong. And so you teach something that the standard is not asking for. And then you try to assess the student on what the standard is asking for. So think about all of that imbalance going on. If this is a stool, you need a stool to sit on. Each leg must be so balanced, right, for it to support learning. So the curriculum has to be aligned, the instruction has to be aligned, and the assessment has to be aligned to create that well-balanced stool.
I like that. I like the thinking of balance, and that if you take one of those out, so there's similarities between this model and yours, Mellisa, in that you have these kind of three pieces. What I like about the burger analogy is that when you bite in, you get a little bit of each. And that's how it should be as we're working through lesson by lesson, week by week. That assessment isn't just one giant thing that happens at the end. It's kind of integrated in each bite. And I like with Serena the stool, the idea that if you take out one of those pieces, curriculum, instruction, or assessment, the thing topples. That you need to have all three of them solid and sturdy for it to work.
System to work, right. Mm-hmm.
And from that article, and we'll drop in the show notes links to the articles in which we were reading and basing some of this off. There's a line that I liked. This is coming from Edutopia, that assessment remains the least understood of the three concepts, referring to that stool, primarily because history and policy limit our understanding of its purposes and possibilities. And I think that's kind of key with this series, is that when we think of assessment, probably a lot of other things pop in mind. But by maybe focusing on one of these three models, whatever one makes sense to you, maybe it helps to kind of reframe and recapture what assessment truly means and truly can mean.
And I think, too, in that quote that you mentioned, a key word for me that sticks out again is the purpose. And so I think one of the things that we do in education is an assessment is built with one purpose in mind, and we end up trying to use the data from that assessment for multiple purposes. And so while there can be several purposes for an assessment, we typically kind of have like three main ones. We think about in the classroom, right? To inform our instruction. Another one is to either screen or identify students in their skills, and then to measure outcomes. And so when you have these three main purposes, it feels as though it is very imperative that you have the right method for the right purpose. And so I feel as though that's a nice segue into when we next time when we get together, we're talking about what is the right method, what is the right tool to use, right? And so we less of that, well, is it more multiple choice, less multiple choice, is it open-ended or not open-ended? But as we discuss in the next series, you'll see that every method has an advantage and disadvantage, and you have to make sure that you're using the right method for the right purpose.
That is perfect. Because, I mean, we oftentimes talk of assessment as in this good or bad binary, when it's what are you using it for? If I take the assessment of whether Eva can use the potty and then apply that to determine whether she's ready for a tricycle, that's not going to work. That doesn't mean that it was a bad assessment. I'm just misapplying my findings from it.
Right. And so even so too, with the assessment, as Mellisa just mentioned, we have different methods of assessments, right? And sometimes, we have to be careful of, using one assessment to try to get to all the evidence of students learning, right? And going back to that potty training, I'm also even thinking about driving. So I'm thinking of assessment being, serving different purposes, right? You want to see, or you want to know if a student can drive, but prior to taking the student on the road, you definitely would want to see, does the student know the road code? Does the student know the rules of the road, right? So I wouldn't want to put the child in a car to, okay, show me that you can drive. I need to know that you know some rules of the road before I put you there, right? So that's when we think about assessment being different methods and different purpose. So that's a good way of thinking about it. Different assessments serving different purpose, and depending on what evidence that we gather from the different methods, that information that we gather, that should drive the next step forward for our students, for our instruction and for our students. What else do they need to know?
So I think I want to end the episode with one of my favorite quotes from Rick Stiggins. The first time I heard it, it really resonated with me, and I used to use it as a poster in my class on my desk. And it says, "You can enhance or destroy students' desire to succeed in school more quickly and permanently through your use of an assessment than with any other tools you have at your disposal." And immediately upon thinking about that was my turning point about really being more intentional about the assessments that I choose and making sure that, again, that I'm using the right tool for the right purpose.
That's perfectly put. And that's what we're going to then dive into in the next few episodes. What use these different assessment methods can have so that we are using them to benefit students, to, give them the full hamburger, to sit beside them, to give them that balanced stool so that they are prepared for life that awaits them. So we look forward to chatting with you over those next few episodes. As always, if you have anything to share with us, questions, comments, requests for other topics, you can reach us at wcpss.net/datalit. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. So welcome back. We hope that you enjoyed our first episode of our first season. I know we sounded a lot greener than we are right now. But yeah, so when we talked about that, one of the things, again, we want you to sort of keep in your mind is as we start to talk about accountability and how we can use accountability for school improvement and better school improvement, the next two episodes we're going to talk about is One of them, we will provide you with these 5 ways of, bridging those two worlds. And then we'll have another episode that's going to be around hearing from district leaders that can kind of help us understand how do they do that work and sort of give us some practical tips for how they do that work in terms of bridging accountability and school improvement.
Sounds good.
So thank you, guys. I hope this kind of gave you some excitement for those next 2 episodes that are coming out. As always, if you want to reach us, you can contact us through our website or through our email, datalit@wcpss.net. And as always, goodbye.
Take care.